South India's towering temple gateways and Gopurams are among its most iconic architectural features. But why are Gopurams not a thing in North India? Why do so few medieval temples survive in the north? To some, the answer is straightforward. Islamic invasions wiped out North Indian temple worship. But the real causes are more complex. Financial and social appeal, as much as devotion, created South India's glorious Gopurams. Okay, so first we need to understand what a Hindu temple means to us today. I think there are many things, but primarily religious and community centers. They are part of our lives where we ask gods for aid or favor and express devotion. We go to temples for festivals to sing, pray, or watch performances. But was this always the case? An overwhelming amount of evidence from medieval India says no, not always. We know this from two sources. The first is architectural. Crowds of devotees require open areas, large roofed compounds, and facilities for water, food, and access to the gods. You can see this in contemporary temples. But the earliest surviving medieval temples from the 5th to 6th century CE were tiny structures in walled-off compounds, as you can see. The second type of evidence comes from inscribed temple donations. Many temples today have plaques advertising patrons and devotees from a diverse cross-section of society. In contrast, inscriptions on early medieval temples like this one suggest that they were built and maintained by courtly aristocrats. There may have been humbler shrines of thatch and wood where poorer communities worshipped their own divinities, but really elaborate stone temples were generally built by royal courts for rituals for their own benefit. There's little evidence that early temples were community centers for all Hindus as we often imagine today. So then, how did temples actually become social hubs? Here, North and South India diverge. Let's look specifically at Tamil Nadu, which has some of the most impressive Gopurams and the most sprawling complexes, often extending to over 100 acres. Now, from around the 8th century onwards, something radically changed the evolution of Tamil temples. This was the Bhakti movement, when Tamil poet saints began to sing the glories of Shiva and Vishnu, describing these gods as actually living in various Tamil towns and villages. Within the next century, as historian Vidya Dehejia writes in The Thief Who Stole My Heart, we see a very different kind of temple patronage in the state. In the 9th to 10th centuries, everyone from shepherds to washer people, gentry to aristocrats were making gifts and renovating shrines. And in comparison to North India, where most temple rituals were conducted in elite Sanskrit, Tamil temples had a strong tradition of Tamil Bhakti singing, tying gods and temples intimately to local communities. Now, I don't want to say that Tamil royals didn't try to build their own exclusive temples, because they absolutely did. But these are not the temples that continued to grow and expand all the way to the present. You see, to remain in active worship, temples required constant infusions of land, labor, and materials. Kings like Rajaraja Chola I and his heir Rajendra I built two colossal temples dedicated to forms of Shiva, named after themselves, but after the decline of the dynasty, these temples barely received any gifts for centuries, and their lands and properties were infringed upon and rededicated. Now, contrast this with other medieval Tamil temples like Srirangam and Chidambaram. They had their own regional and community loyalties and received gifts not just from kings, but also from local gentry and magnates. In Tamil Nadu from the 12th century onwards, as studied by historians James Heitzman and Noboru Karashima in the books that you see on your screen, gifting lands to temples also brought tax concessions. This, coupled with local loyalties, ensured that they were maintained by the communities through the centuries, no matter who was ruling. Popular Tamil temples remain relevant through social and economic upheavals as well. In the 12th century, martial families patronized them. In the 14th and 15th centuries, as the global textile trade grew, weavers became patrons. And by the 18th century, as global merchant capitalism boomed, Chettiar merchants took over. As many groups concentrated their activities in these temple complexes, enormous gopurams were built and patrons competed to gild roofs, add halls, and pay for processions and services in their local temples. Expanded temples brought larger crowds. Larger crowds brought more gifts and paid for further expansions. So why didn't this happen in North India? In his book chapter Religious and Royal Patronage in North India from this book, historian Michael Willis points out that local communities did occasionally build temples there. But patronage, according to inscriptions at least, was an elite affair of the Sanskrit-speaking courts. The most spectacular medieval North Indian temples, like those at Khajuraho, which you can see on your screen, were built by courts and then abandoned when their dynasties collapsed. Generally speaking, in North India, conquerors preferred to build their own shrines rather than renovate that of a previous dynasty. In South India, kings competed to expand older temples like Srirangam because they were tied to local communities instead of local dynasties. Some temples were also targeted by invading armies. For example, the Deccan Emperor Indra III attacked the temple of the goddess Kalapriya when he invaded North India, as you can see from this inscription. North Indian dynasties that struggled politically couldn't repair attacked temples. In the 11th century, when another Deccan emperor, Someshwara I, invaded Madhya Pradesh, he disrupted the construction of the Bhojeshwara temple at Bhojpur, which, if completed, would have been the largest temple built in North India until the 1700s. But after this Deccan invasion, the Bhojeshwara's patrons never recovered, and the temple remains unfinished to this day, as you can see in this photo. But these invasions, coupled with North India's own warfare, were partially responsible for the many abandoned medieval temples that you can still see in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan and Gujarat. Without the support of their communities, many of these temples were simply never rebuilt. The Gangetic Plains also saw internecine warfare and South Indian invasions, but unlike the regions mentioned, there's almost no medieval temples here from before 1500. There's no doubt that sultans were partially responsible for this. From the 12th century onwards, Sultanate attacks here disrupted monastic networks and destroyed any royal temples that were actively in worship. This was different in scale, but I don't think it was different in concept from the older examples that we just saw. And despite the Sultan's colorful claims of destruction, it's very doubtful that they actually had the capacity to actually do all this, as argued by Pakistani historian Fuzia Farooq Ahmad in Muslim Rule in Medieval India. So then, what happened to all the Gangetic temples? I think it's because they were most often built of brick. Once abandoned, they were just mined by locals for building materials or buried under the ever-shifting alluvial soil. That's what happened, for example, with Mohenjo-daro. North India is still littered with unexcavated archaeological mounds, especially in UP and Bihar. Further studies will continue to complicate our understanding of this period. India's diversity isn't just a slogan. Diversity means varying historical trajectories, conception of religion, and social behaviors. The crucial factor for a temple's survival wasn't whether it was attacked by invaders or whether its royal patrons disappeared. Temples survived if they commanded local loyalties and had a reputation as a sacred site. That insulated them from political, religious, or social turbulence. South Indian temples took on the glorious forms they did because of their precocious vernacular bhakti movements, which shaped the region's understanding of temples for centuries. As always in our politics, something that seems superficially to be caused by Muslim rulers turns out to have a far more complicated history. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media, and you can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.